Morning, everybody, and welcome back to the session on economics and finance. Yesterday, we had covered about 1.5 of the 4 topics that we are supposed to be doing here. The topic that we are doing currently is the topic on public finance, and we had started by looking at the fact that this topic is about the functions of the government. As I had said yesterday in the very first lecture, the topic 2 and topic 3 are about the intervention by the government in the economy. The government intervenes in the economy through 2 types of policies mainly. One is the fiscal policy, which is about the revenues and expenditures of the government. And the second is the monetary policy, which is about the money supply and the rate of interest. Okay. As I had said at that time, first we will look at the basics underlying these theories, and then we will look at the basic theories per se, the policies per se. So in this chain, first we will look at the fiscal policy, the government finances. We had started the topic by asking the question as to why is there a need for the government to intervene in the economy. We had seen that Musgrave had suggested that there are 3 types of functions that the government is supposed to be performing in the economy. Okay, let me take you back very quickly through that. There are 3 functions that the government is supposed to perform. One is the allocation function, then the distribution function, and third is the stabilization function. In order to understand the functions, we had seen that if we look at the basic question that we are trying to answer in economics, the question is, given the limited scarce resources that we have in the economy and the unlimited wants that we are supposed to satisfy using these limited resources, the question arises is, since there are so many different types of things to be produced, what do we produce with these resources? And how do we produce? Because each given commodity can be produced using a number of possible combinations of the given factors of production. Okay. The standard answer that has been, one standard answer has been that it should be left to the market forces. Market forces I forgot to share the screen. I hope will come now. Okay. So allocation function, distribution function, and the stabilization function. Market forces basically operate through the price signals. In the market, demand and supply interact to give you prices for various factors of production and the commodities. And markets function on the basis of that. The market mechanism will ensure efficient allocation of resources only if the prices and the price signals that are generated through the market are efficient ones, in the sense that they reflect the actual demand and supply conditions. What are the demand and supply conditions? The demand curve for any commodity gives us the amount that the buyer will be actually willing to pay for buying that quantity, which in turn will depend on the benefits to that particular individual from buying that commodity. On the other hand, the supply curve gives us the price that the supplier will be charging for supplying the given number of units of that particular commodity, which in turn will reflect the costs. However, there are many situations in which the demand and supply curves may not reflect, either these curves may not exist, or even if these curves exist, these may not reflect the true gains to be made by the buyer by buying that particular commodity, or the true cost to the seller in supplying that commodity. If that is the case, then the demand and supply curves, and therefore the price signals that come out of this demand supply interaction will not reflect the true condition in the market. One important point here is that when we are looking at the society, we would be concerned with those levels of output, that allocation of resources, which would maximize the welfare of the entire society. That means all the households and all the individuals in the society taken together. One type of problem that may arise is that the demand curve does not reflect the total gains to the society by consumption of that particular commodity by the individuals. Similarly, the supply curve may not reflect the cost to the entire society by production of, by supply of that particular commodity. In that case, the prices may be beneficial, prices may be efficient from the point of view of reflecting the welfare of the individuals, but we are concerned with the welfare of the entire society. Okay? In such a situation where demand curve or supply curve may not, either of them may not exist, or even if they exist, the prices that are generated out of that are not efficient ones, the allocation of resources that will result will not be an efficient one, and it becomes important for the government to intervene in the market in order to ensure that the allocation is efficient one, and that is the idea of the allocation function. We will discuss this in more detail in a short while, but this is just to clarify further the basic underlying issue. If this issue is clear to you, then you will be able to understand further whatever discussed in the subsequent chapters in topic 2. Okay. Then the next, so after what to produce and how to produce, the next question is, that is, for whom to produce. Okay. For whom to produce means who will get access to the goods and services produced. Obviously, the access to goods and services in the market economy is provided by income. If you have income, you can buy the goods and services. Okay. So the question then turns to, how is the income and wealth distributed in the economy? It is quite clear that if everything is left entirely to the market forces, the allocation of resources will not be equitable. By equitable resources, we mean, by equitable distribution of resources, we mean that it is not very skewed. It is not the case that some people are extremely rich and others are extremely poor. That type of extreme divergence will not be there. Okay, it will be more equitable. Okay? But if left to the market forces, that will be the case. But if this is the case, then it will not be fair, because look at the people who are extremely poor, who cannot even have access to the basic necessities required for survival, such as basic food, basic shelter, basic clothing, etc. Of course, basic education, other. And in such a situation, it becomes important for the government to, in some ways, provide them sufficient resources so that they can have access to the basics of life. Okay? So this, of course, for doing that, the government has to have resources from somewhere. So the government has to collect resources from the people who are comparatively better off. So this is what the government does in the distribution function. Finally, as we had discussed yesterday, it is quite clear now. It became clear initially during the Great Depression of about 90 years back that if left to itself, the economy will not always work at full employment level necessarily. The level of employment and level of employment will fluctuate. Okay, sometimes there will be overemployment, sometimes there will be underemployment, and accordingly output will fluctuate. This type of fluctuations are called business cycles. This type of business cycles are not desirable completely, because if the employment level declines to very low level, there will be several people who will be unemployed. And if they are unemployed, they are not getting no income, then you can understand the plight of such people. On the other hand, if there is a rise in output beyond full employment level, it leads to inflationary pressures. Okay, if prices are rising, again, this is not good for people. Therefore, it becomes important for the government to stabilize the business cycles. Okay, and that is the idea of stabilization function. there are other dimensions of stabilization functions such as controlling inflation. It has been acknowledged now almost by all in the economics profession that some low and stable level of inflation is good for the economy. It is required for the economy. There are many reasons for that, for which I don't think I can afford to go given the time frame that we have. But all I can say here is that some low level of inflation is good. But then what we observe in many countries is that inflation is not low, inflation is high. We don't have 2 or 3% inflation. There have been episodes where inflation has been 7, 8. In India, we have seen the episode just about 7, 8 years back when inflation was persistently above 10% for several quarters. And with high inflation comes unstable inflation. Inflation keeps fluctuating wildly. Sometimes 7%, other times 11%. So idea is that we should stabilize this inflation. Okay. So this is the objective of price stability, low and stable inflation. Let's now go to the issue of first. Let's not go to the discussion of each of these functions in more detail. Before that, let me take a quick look if there is some urgent question to be taken. Please keep posting questions. There is one question I have got about free ridership. As I quickly revise the market failure thing, I'll come to the public good things. I'll come to that. The first reason, so as we have discussed, we need the allocation rule to be played by the government because the allocation made by the market forces may not be efficient one. Okay. This is called the case of market failure. Market fails to allocate the resources efficiently. Efficiently means the allocation which would ensure the best utilization of resources for the society. There are 4 reasons why this may be the case. One is market power or monopoly power, in which this is basically means that the markets are able to charge above the margin. The producers have some market power, some pricing power, as a result of which they are able to charge above marginal cost. You have all studied in your microeconomics course that if there is perfect competition in the economy, the firms are price takers, okay, and therefore they cannot charge anything above the marginal cost. But if there is some sort of monopoly, there is imperfection in the competition, there is some monopoly power, they will be able to charge above marginal cost, and as we have seen yesterday, that would mean that the supply curve would lie above the competitive supply curve. As a result, if the supply curve lies above the competitive supply curve, the quantity supplied would be lower and price charge would be higher than the corresponding levels under the competitive equilibrium. Okay. Next is we were looking at the externalities. Externalities basically means that there are costs or benefits by use or production of some commodity which are not internalized in the market mechanism. If I'm consuming something, okay, I'll have some gains, which is what is reflected when I purchase that, the price that I am willing to pay for buying that commodity, that is reflected in my demand curve. But if my use of that commodity has some effects for my neighbors, if there's some positive effects, in that case, the overall gain to the society will be much higher than the gain on the basis of which I have bought that. Okay, if there is some way I can be compensated for the additional gains people are making, and therefore I am willing to pay even higher price than I paid, then the demand curve would lie above the demand curve that exists for me as of now. As a result of that, quantity produced would be higher. So positive externalities mean the goods are underproduced. We had taken the example of negative production externalities. The externalities arising out of production process, we had taken example of negative externality caused due to pollution. We have seen that if a firm is releasing pollutants, the pollutants will generally not be reflected in the firm's cost curve. Okay, the firm's cost curve will just reflect the cost of inputs and the raw material. It will not reflect the cost to the society. As a result, the cost curve, the supply curve will not reflect all the costs to the entire society. It will reflect the private cost. We call in that case the marginal private cost curve. But since the total cost of the society is higher than the marginal so private cost, the marginal social cost curve will lie above the marginal private cost curve, the difference being the external effect, externality. Okay, we can see if there are negative externalities, the quantity produced will be much more than the socially desirable level. Okay, so this is the idea of externalities. We had seen that. Then we had come to the case of, so this reflects that marginal social cost will be equal to marginal private cost plus external cost and overproduced. Finally, we had come to the question of private goods and public goods. This is the last topic that we had covered yesterday. I decided to revise this in some detail because I have realized, even going by the questions, that some people, that these topics do require some careful understanding. The private goods have three important attributes. Private goods are the goods that we usually come across and we buy in the economic, clothes, stationery, automobiles, etc. Okay. There are three important attributes. One is the rivalry. Idea is that if I'm using some commodity, you cannot use it. If you want to use it at the same time that I'm using it, in that case it has to be produced. An additional unit of that commodity has to be produced. Okay, and these goods are excludable. So if you want to use it, you cannot. One can exclude you from using that if one wants, and this possibility of excluding you from using that commodity allows the use of fee to exclude you. Okay, so if you want to use it, you will have to pay a fee, and then these are divisible. One can clearly see how many units are being consumed. Whether you are eating one burger or two burger, you have to clearly. It is quite clear. Okay, so using all these three attributes, whenever you want to consume some private good, you have to buy. The goods have to be produced separately. It has to be bought separately. The specific number of units that you want to consume has to be specified, and the price that you're willing to pay for that has to be specified. So the demand curve clearly exists. Okay, demand curve exists, supply curve would exist. As a result, price signal will be generated. However, the case of the public goods is just contrary to that. There are the three attributes that we have seen yesterday needs to be revised, looked at from the other, in the opposite direction. The public goods are non-rivalrous. So if I am using one good, there is no reason you cannot use it. Look at the TV signal, for instance. If I am using the TV signal from some service provider, there is no reason you cannot. National defense. If I am using this, if I am taking advantage of the security being provided at my society gate, there is no reason. And if that is the case, then obviously it will be beneficial to everyone. Okay? Then excludability. If fee can be charged for its use. Okay, look at the case of national defense, for instance. There is no way fee can be charged from you for its provision. Okay, if the security forces are there on the border, I am protected and you are also protected. There is no way you will not be protected when there are security forces sitting there. Okay, then divisibility. We cannot say how much of national security we used. Or the other example is the public street light. So there is no divisibility. You cannot say I use so many units of this, you use so many. That is not the case. So these three attributes. One other issue related to excludability was that if a person A cannot be excluded from the use of some public good because the one is not paying. So if you can, that means you can use it without paying for it. And if you can use the public good without paying for it, then there is no incentive for you to pay. There is no pressure on you to pay. There is no force on you to pay for that. And therefore, you can use a service without paying for that. If that is the case, the amount that one would be willing to pay for that, the other person who bought it, that person bought it, you are taking advantage of that without paying. So obviously, then it will not be reflected in the demand curve. Okay, so in such case, the true demand curve will not exist. So due to these three things, the true demand curve doesn't exist for the public goods, and therefore these cannot be provided by the market. So this is the idea of basic public good. Public. Okay. I will take further questions at the end of this topic. For now, let's proceed with the topic. Distinction is generally made between pure public goods and impure public goods. Pure public goods, we have seen the cases of rivalry and excludability. There are very few goods which are pure public goods. Okay, in the sense that they are completely non-rivalrous, they are completely non-excludable. Okay, and it should be clear. If look at the case of a highway, it is true that if I am using the highway, it does in no way prevent you from using the highway. Okay? So pure public goods which are completely rivalrous, completely non-excludable. Okay? But most of the goods are rivalrous to some extent. I was talking about the example of a highway. If you are using a highway, of course, it doesn't mean that I cannot use it. But suppose a large number of people are using the highway, then it will lead to congestion. Okay? And then it makes it inconvenient for others to use that highway. Others may not be able to use it as comfortably as they were when there were few users of that. Okay? So my use of highway in some way does affect your use of the highway. Similarly, the highways are not completely non-excludable these days. You must have seen, all of you, that there are access controlled highways these days. So the people who are paying toll on that will be able to access them. Others will not be able to access them. Okay. Look at the example of a road light that I was talking about yesterday. A road light. Of course, if you are using the road light, that doesn't mean that I cannot use the road light. But there is only some area around the pole at which the road light is placed where you can access the road light with reasonable degree of comfort to a reasonable extent. Okay? If there are 5 people sitting in that area, then obviously it may not be possible for the others to sit in that particular area where the road light can be accessed comfortably. So, in that case, even road light is not completely non-rivalrous. It is rivalrous. Then there are things like television channel. Okay, the television broadcast. If you have television signal, these days you know very well that television signals are excludable these days. You can access the television signals only if you have access to the set-top box which converts the signals to a form which can be read by your television set. Okay, so the example that we have seen yesterday, many of those examples actually do not have the perfect attributes of public goods, and these are called therefore impure public goods. The idea of impure public goods is important because while for the pure public goods the demand curves do not exist, for impure public goods demand curves do exist, even if there are certain issues with those demand curves, which can obviously be taken care of using the policies that we will study in the next subtopic. But the point is, if the public goods are impure, then there is some scope for the private sector, for the market to provide those. While for the pure public goods, given the fact that demand curve does not exist, these goods cannot be provided by the private sector at all. Okay, so that is the difference. There are many types of private goods, impure public goods, which are discussed in your book. I will not go into much detail, but I would nevertheless I would like to highlight a few important types of impure public goods. Okay. One type of public good is called mixed goods. These are the goods which are private goods, you are consuming them, but these have externalities associated with them which may have characteristics of public good. So these are called quasi. Among impure public goods, one is quasi public goods or mixed goods. These are the goods such that these are private goods, but external effects of a public good. Okay, so these goods are called private good, and we have already seen the examples of these yesterday: health, education, etc. Of course, there could be negative things also, but the idea is that these are the goods which have some externalities so large in magnitude potentially that they have the attributes of public goods. And therefore, even though private sector can provide such services, the level at which the private sector provides them may be suboptimal from the point of view of the entire society. Since as we have already seen that externalities cause, if there are positive externalities, the gain to the individual from consuming that commodity is far less than the gain to the overall society. And therefore, in such a situation, that particular commodity will tend to be underproduced compared to the level which is socially desirable from the entire society's point of view. Okay? So in such a situation, even though the private sector can provide them, it is desirable that there is some type of intervention. The other type of impure public goods is common area resources. These are the resources which are non-rivalrous, which are rivalrous, but these are non-excludable. Common area resources are our environment. Okay? And more importantly, a better example of this would be like a pond in which you can go for fishing. It is rivalrous. Okay, so if you are catching fish there, if there are 5 fishermen already catching fish there, 5 people already catching fish there, the others obviously will have more difficulty catching fish. But then these are non-excludable. To the extent it's a public property, it is no one can prevent you from using that particular this. One other important type of common area resource that was found in villages is the grazing area for the cattle. Okay, so it was a common area, so everyone used to use it. And the advantage is that since it is non-excludable, these are overused. Since no one needs to pay anything for using them, these are non-excludable, so no one thinks of paying for it, and if one is not required to pay for use of that particular resource, then such resources are overused, overexploited, and as a result, they are depleted and degraded very fast. So that's the problem. This is called the tragedy of commons. Look at our environment. To what extent it has been polluted, and obviously, if this happens, this type of depletion, this type of degradation has consequences for the future generations. Okay, we have access to it, but if we are overusing it, which happens because we are not required to pay for that, which happens because these resources are non-excludable. So if these are non-excludable, therefore we don't have to pay for that. We tend to overuse it. It tends to deplete very fast. And in that case, not much of that is left after a while. As a result, the future generations will not have access to it. Okay. Finally, let me come to the other. So we have so far discussed three issues, but why the government may need to intervene in order to ensure efficient allocation of resources. One is the market failure, which basically means that if left to itself, the market may not be able to allocate the resources efficiently. Market may fail to allocate the resources efficiently. Second is the issue of externalities. It could be positive, it could be negative. Third is the case of public goods. We have seen how public goods are different from the private goods, and we have seen we may have pure public goods, which are very few. Mostly we come across impaired public goods, and the advantage of impaired public goods is that it has some attributes of private goods, and therefore it is not impossible for the private sector to provide it, which means both the private sector and public sector can provide it, which broadens the ability to provide them. Finally, we come to incomplete information. Incomplete information is about the basic idea. It is also called asymmetric information. Mostly the information is asymmetric. Asymmetric information, which means there is imbalance. Before I go to asymmetric information, let me give you even more in a more basic way the idea of what incomplete information could be and how it could affect the ability of the markets to allocate the resources efficiently. Let me take you again to the basic framework of a market economy, the demand and supply curve. We have seen that the prices are determined by the demand and supply curves. The price that you will be willing to pay for a given commodity will depends on the gains that you think you will be able to derive out of that. Okay, which means that when you are paying, you are expressing your willingness to pay a given price for buying a certain number of units of a commodity. You have perfect information about the gain that you will be able to have out of consuming that particular commodity in that many number of units. Okay. Similarly, the supply curve means that when the producer is charging a price, the producer knows perfectly well the costs that will arise due to provision of that commodity. Okay. So they reflect perfect information. If there is a gap, if the information is not perfect, then the actual gain to the individual will turn out to be different from the gains on the basis of which the individual had paid the price. Similarly, if the cost to the supplier turns out to be different from the cost on the basis of which the supplier had supplied the commodity in the economy, in the market, in that case, the cost curve that determines the price does not reflect the true supply conditions. Okay, so in that case, the price signal that we had will not be a perfect one in the sense of capturing every piece of information pertaining to the provision of that commodity. And if that price signal is not perfect, then obviously the allocation of resources will not be efficient. Okay, so information becomes very important. There are many cases. One very common, you must have come across this. Suppose one person is suffering from a disease, okay, and needs to go for some treatment, you must have seen that people keep saying, okay, we need to find out which hospital has a good specialist for that, which hospital has good facilities for indoor treatment of this disease, etc. And if they do not know as to which hospital has good facilities, obviously the price that they will be willing to pay does not will be affected. Okay, so this is very common. The other thing that we come across that you come across at your age level is about education. Suppose you want to go to some institute to get some more training into the skills that you want to acquire. You will find these in almost every discipline. You will find several institutes which are providing training in that, but you don't know the quality of the institution. And this is another case of information, incomplete information. Okay, and this might lead to making a wrong choice potentially. Okay, let me come to asymmetric information. Asymmetric information is one particular type of case of incomplete information. This is the information when there is the imbalance in the amount of information available between two parties. There are two parties in every transaction, and it may happen that information available to one of them is more than the information available to the other. This is the case of asymmetric information. Asymmetric information has severe consequences for the functioning of the markets. Okay. There are two types of problems that arise due to asymmetric information. One is adverse selection and other is moral hazard. Please try to understand these two concepts very carefully. This adverse selection problem arises before the transaction takes place, and therefore the markets may not even function. The basic idea is the following. The person in a transaction is the one who is likely to produce bad outcome. To look at this, look at the market for old cars. In the market for used cars, when you are buying a car directly from the company, it's a fresh car. You know very well the quality is because you are going by the name of that particular company, and there is a reputation that the company carries, and of course it gives you the warranty. So there is no reason for you to worry about the quality of the car. Okay, but suppose you are buying a used car, the quality of used cars can vary in a big way. So there can be some car which is of very poor quality, and there can be some car which is of very good quality. Suppose there are suppose 10 cars which are identical in all the respects. Okay, the same make, same year, everything, but their quality differs. There are two parties in the transaction: the person who is the seller of the old car, who has been using it all through, and then it is you, the potential buyer. There is asymmetric information in the sense that the person who is selling the car has more information about the quality of the car than you have. So what will happen? Just think about it. If the car is of very poor quality, you would be willing to pay a low price for that car. Okay? And if the car is of very good quality, you will be willing to pay high price. So low quality, low price, high quality, high price. When you are going to the used car market, you do not know for a given car whether it's a good quality car or bad quality car. Suppose there are cars of all the qualities there. But since you do not have an exact idea about the given car that you are standing before, whether it's a good one or a bad one, how will you quote the price that you will be willing to pay? You look at the average price of the car. Okay, but then if you are paying the average price of the car, look at the person whose car is a good quality one. The person's car is a good quality one, and if that person is, and so the price that his or her car commands, the price or his car could give him will be much more than the average price, because average price will obviously be lower than the price for the best, for a good quality car. On the other hand, this average price will be above the price for a bad quality car. Since you will be willing to pay just the average price in the absence of the information about the actual quality of the car being considered, the person who owns the car as of now may not be willing to pay you. To take a concrete example, numerical example, suppose the worst quality car doesn't deserve more than say 1.5 lakh rupees, but the best quality car deserves say 4.5 lakh rupees. Okay, so you'd be willing to pay somewhere say 3 lakh rupees because you don't know the quality. The person whose car could fetch him 4.5 lakh rupees obviously will not be willing to pay 3 lakh rupees to give the car for 3 lakh rupees, and therefore that person would exit the market. As this happens, and more people, the good quality cars, but who will be willing to pay in that case, to sell the person in that case? The person who has a bad quality car, the person whose car is just worth 1.5 lakh rupees, if that person is getting 3 lakh rupees, it's a very nice deal for him or her. So that person will be willing. So in such a situation, only those people who are bad quality cars will be willing to stay in the market. So that is the problem of adverse selection. Selection of adverse consequence cars. Okay. Another name for this problem is the Lemons problem. And you can see in this case, market will not function. The other is moral hazard. The asymmetric information problem is also called the Lemons problem. Moral hazard, this happens after the transaction has taken place. This basically means that the informed person taking advantage of for this, let me give you the example of a loan dispersal. Okay, suppose there is a person who is willing to. There are people who are willing to extend loans because they have surplus funds available, and there are people who are available to borrow the funds. Okay. Now, of course, for you, the lender, the cost of borrowing will depend among other things on the probability of repayment. If the probability of repayment is low, then the cost to you will be very high. Okay, you are lending your funds and your funds will not come back in entirety in time. Okay, so the person who is taking the loan is in a better position than you in terms of information about the probability of the loan being repaid. Okay, so this is again a case of asymmetric information. The problem of adverse selection arises here, and so does the problem of moral hazard. Problem of adverse selection arises in the following manner. There are 10 types of borrowers, 10 borrowers available, and some are very poor in terms of repayment ability. Others are very good in terms of repayment ability, but you do not know what the risk involved with them. Okay, some have very high risk of default. So you would be willing. So since the cost potentially is very high, you would be willing to charge a very high price to them, a high interest rate to them. Others have very low probability of default, and you would be willing to charge a very low. And a simple interest will do because you will not charge an additional interest on account of the risk arising. Okay, a person who is good credit risk, who has low probability of default, will not be willing to take loan at high interest. Okay, because if you are into a genuine business, you will not have very high rate of return. Okay, only those people will be willing to take loans at very high rates of interest who do not have good chances of repaying it. They don't have good intentions of repaying. Okay, so in such a situation should be clear. Only those people will be willing to pay, will be willing to take interest at high interest. Those who are bad credit risk. Adverse selection. But then this also can be used as a good example to explain the problem of moral hazard. Suppose loan has been disclosed. Loan was taken on the basis of some information provided regarding the use to which the amount borrowed would be put. Suppose it was taken in the name of starting a business. Some business proposal was shown to the lender that, okay, this is the proposal we have, and the loan sanctioning person went through the document and found it satisfactory and it is a good business, low risk business. Right? But after the loan has been sanctioned, the other person knows better what the person who is borrowing the amount knows better what he or she is doing with it. Not the person who has lent the amount. The person who has borrowed the amount has an opportunity to engage in, for instance, risky ventures. You take a loan for start setting up a plant. But once you have taken the loan, maybe you have an incentive to invest it in some scheme which has very low probability although, but it has very high expected, it might provide you very high return. It is you who knows what you are doing with the funds, not the party who lent you. But if something goes wrong with the funds, suppose you lose the funds in the risky venture, ultimately it is the person who has given you the loan who will suffer and not you. This is the problem of moral hazard. The informed person takes advantage of the uninformed person. And if there is such a risk, obviously you will not be willing to extend the loan. Okay? As a result, in the market for loans, loan transaction will not take place. So this is how the markets break down. So these are the cases how the four factors, namely the market power, secondly the externalities, thirdly the public goods, and fourthly the asymmetric information may lead to a situation where the market does not provide efficient allocation of resources, or this, which is called the market failure to allocate the resources efficiently. Okay? And in such a situation, it becomes important for the state, for the government to intervene in the market to ensure efficient allocation of resources. Now let's go to the question of in what ways can the government intervene the market failure due to these four types. The intervention of the government in the case of market failure depends on the reason for market failure. First issue that we discussed for market failure was the monopoly power or market power. Market power, we have seen, leads to low quantity and high price. Okay. Let us see how the government can intervene in the market to provide this. Government has acts to prevent of monopoly power and they have act to promote competition. For instance, India, we have the Competition Act, which was amended in 2005. Amended in 2007, and we have a body called Competition Commission of India. Which monitor the market, and whenever there are cases of monopolistic practices by the firms, they take suitable action. Okay, so they for instance, will monitor the market closely, and if they find that there are certain firms which are colluding to jack up the prices artificially or control the quantity below the socially desirable level, then they will take action. Okay, so such actions are routinely taken cognizance of by the commissions, or if there is some complaint made by some party, these are looked into and appropriate actions are taken so that the market prices, so that the market power is kept to the minimum possible level. But then the other form is that of price regulation. We have seen that monopoly affects by reducing the quantity and raising the price. Price regulation, this becomes particularly important in case of natural monopolies. Natural monopoly basically is a monopoly which would be desirable from the society's point of view. Now, it may appear somewhat may not appear plausible that a monopoly may be good for the economy given the problems that we have seen with the monopoly since yesterday. But there are situations in which monopoly could be good for the economy. This would happen when there are good economies of scale. Okay, as a result, one firm providing service to the entire market will lead to lower cost than multiple firms. I hope you have read about economies of scale. Economies of scale means that as you provide, as a larger quantity of a good is supplied, the average cost, marginal cost, goes on declining. Okay, suppose marginal cost is declining in a big way. As a result, let me show this through a diagram. So that makes things clearer. Suppose this is the marginal cost curve. Think about it. Look at two scenarios. One, a single firm providing services, and second, two sub-firms providing services. Suppose this is the size of the market here. This is the size of the market. So half would be here. Okay, imagine two scenarios. Scenario one, a single firm is providing services in the entire market, and secondly, two firms are providing services in one half of the market each. Okay, it could be, for instance, in case of provision of electricity distribution. Now, if the single firm is providing services, the cost would be here. Okay, but if two firms are providing services, the cost would be here. You can understand. In this case, cost would be much higher, and therefore it would be beneficial. Given this is the idea of economies of scale, that as we expand the scale of production, the marginal the cost to this overall to society goes on declining on marginal basis, and so on the average basis. So in such a situation, it is better if the single firm provides services to the entire market instead of the services being provided by multiple firms. But then, once you allow for monopoly, if there are two firms, there will be some competition between the two. But if there is a single firm providing services, then what happens? Then the firm has an incentive to keep prices at high levels. So this temptation on the part of this single firm, this natural monopoly, may cause the consumers to be forced to pay high price. And in this type of situation, government puts regulation in terms of price caps. You must have heard of electricity regulatory authorities. For instance, in Delhi, one has Delhi Regulatory DERC, Delhi Electricity Regulatory Commission. This commission considers whenever there is a proposal by the electricity distribution companies in Delhi to raise the electricity charges, and it ensures that the prices being charged are not out of line too much with the costs. And that way it ensures that the prices will be raised only if it is convinced that costs have risen to such a level which would necessitate the higher prices without putting undue burden on the consumer. Okay, so there should be a fair rate of return to the electricity providing company, but at the same time, it should not be unnecessarily burdensome. Unnecessarily burdensome. When the costs are high and the firms are not getting adequate rate of return, then of course it is not unnecessary burden for the consumer. This burden becomes necessary. Okay? But if the rate of return is already high, and despite that, using the market power, the firm wants to raise price, it is an unnecessary burden. Electricity regulatory commissions that we ensure that the consumers do not suffer this unnecessary burden due to the presence of natural monopoly. Okay, the second is the second reason why the markets fail is the case of externalities. Now let's come to externalities. We have seen that due to externalities, the social cost may be different from the private cost, or the social gain may be different from the private gains, and therefore the price signals that are arising and due to such arising in such a market condition may not be the ones which would ensure efficient allocation of resources. How does the government do it? How does the government control for such things? Let's first start through the example of negative production externalities. We have already discussed the case of pollution. Let's discuss this type of tools with the help of that example. There are two types of controls that the government can take. One is the direct measures. Another is we will spend more time on the market-based policies, which in a way seek to internalize the externalities. But let's first discuss the direct measures very quickly. The direct measures are basically about some prohibition on the activities that create negative externalities. Okay, so it could be outright prohibition of such activities, or it may be limits with provisions for penalty. So you may say that, okay, this type of activities which are producing such pollution will be completely banned. Okay, you must have seen that there was certain type of mining activities, etc., which were prohibited by the legal order. Okay, because these were causing huge pollution. So that is one thing. Okay, or the government can say, yes, fine, we can understand the activity that you are undertaking, even though it is leading to some pollution, it is necessary for the economy. So fine, you go ahead with it, but the pollution level should be limited to this specified levels, and if that is these these norms for pollution levels are violated, then you will have to face penal action. So that is other possibility. So there could, or maybe there could be fee on emissions. that okay, if you have so many emissions, if your emissions are up to this level, you will have to pay this much fee. If your emissions are up to this level, you will have to pay this much fee. So this type of prohibition, etc., can limit the level of pollution. But despite the fact that these will serve to limit the level of pollution, these still keep the gains, keep the costs external to the market mechanism. Okay. The focus of a government in the market economy is to make sure that to the extent possible, whatever action you are taking is affecting the economy through the market mechanism. How? It will align the costs, social cost, the private, we know that in case of negative production externalities, the social cost is more than the private cost. If government can devise some way to ensure that the private cost and social cost are aligned with each other, in that case, the government will be bringing the private cost curve to the level of social cost curve. So, the price signals that are coming in the market will reflect the true cost. And therefore, market itself will take care of the things. So, you are not imposing anything from your own side, you are just correcting the problem that existed, the gap that existed between the private cost and the social cost. And once you correct for that, the market will have a true idea about the true cost, and therefore market will take care of the things. So idea is to let the market take care of the issues by filling whatever gaps that existed between true social cost and true private cost. How does the government do it? Government can impose tax. This type of tax are called Pigouvian taxes. So internalizing involves, one way to internalize would be to impose tax on pollution. These are called Pigouvian taxes because these were suggested by an economist called A.C. Pigou, Arthur Cecil Pigou, a classical economist. The idea of this can be understood by looking at the diagram that we discussed yesterday. Or maybe I can take you through a diagram that is given in your book so that it is more familiar to you. We have seen yesterday that in case of negative externalities, this is marginal private cost, this is the marginal social cost. So the private cost lies below the social cost. As a result, the quantity that is being actually produced is Q1, which is above the quantity that would be produced if the entire cost of the society were to be taken care of. Okay, and the price charge is lower than that price. Price is lower, then obviously consumption of this commodity would be high. One way you can see here would be to fill this gap by imposing some tax so that this cost curve shifts here. Okay, so that the private and social costs are equal. This is precisely what is done through the Pigouvian tax. Look at this diagram. This is the marginal social benefit. This is the marginal private cost. This is the marginal social cost, the diagram that we have just noted. Now, if the government imposes this amount of tax, what will happen? The marginal private cost plus tax curve will bring the output to the level required. So, this is the socially desirable level of output we have seen. This is the socially desirable price. By imposing this much tax, the government is able to bring the level of production and prices to the socially desirable levels. This is the idea of Pigouvian taxes. Okay, but then even though the idea of Pigouvian taxes is straightforward, its implementation is difficult. Its practical implementation poses some practical implementation problems. Let's come to what are these problems. Okay. One issue is it is difficult to determine because it involves estimation of social costs. Now, private cost is very easy to determine. Private cost, private benefit. In order to determine the private cost, what the person will do, what will the supplier do? The supplier will look at the total cost in terms of raw material, in terms of energy, in terms of electricity, etc. Look at the factors of production. It will determine the total cost involved. That is straightforward. What would the social cost? Social cost is very difficult to measure, and it's a general truth which arises when we are dealing with policy issues. Okay, so the social costs as well as social benefits are very difficult to measure. If you cannot estimate social cost correctly, then how can you estimate the gap between the social cost and the private cost? And if you cannot estimate the gap between the social cost and private cost, then how do you determine the tax to be imposed? Because the quantum of tax to be imposed obviously will be governed by the gap between the social cost and the private cost. If the gap is large, you will be paying you will be imposing a higher tax. But if you cannot measure this gap, then how can you determine the correct amount of tax to be imposed? So that is one problem. Secondly, if you want to monitor this, then if you want to impose a tax, then you have to monitor the pollution levels, which would require expensive administrative steps. That is another thing. Third, this is the common problem. It affects by affecting the price. Okay, but if the commodity is price inelastic, then it will not work. Then the producers, the suppliers, burden onto the consumers, and therefore no burden as a result will not be affected that much. This can again be understood with the help of a diagram. As I hope you know, elasticity of demand is reflected in the slope of the aggregate demand curve. Okay, a given change in the slope of the demand curve, if the given change in price leads to large changes in quantity, then it is elastic. Okay, and in such a situation, and this you can understand since we are measuring the quantity on the horizontal axis and price on the vertical axis, a given change in price leading to large changes in quantity would be reflected in a flat demand curve. If the quantity is highly price elastic, if the demand is highly price elastic, in that case, a given change in price will lead to large changes in quantity, and therefore the firms cannot afford to raise prices by a big margin because the demand would be reduced. But if the price elasticity of demand is not very large, in that case, even if the firms raises prices by a big margin, the quantity will not be affected that much. And this is, for instance, true for necessities. Okay, or there could be other quantity things which people sort of cannot make do without that much. If people are addicted to something, they're not able to make do without that. So, in such a situation, if those are the commodities that we are considering, imposing a tax will not lead to imposing a tax in that case will just mean shifting of the burden to the consumer. Consumer will have to pay a higher price, but the price will not be, it will not be affected. Okay, and of course, one final problem is it will have effect on employment. Suppose look at India. India has a large number of states, and suppose one state enforces strict restrictions on environmental issues. Okay, and other state suppose does not. What happens if one state is imposing such restrictions? The firms looking at high cost such taxes would imply may think of shifting their production base to the other state which is not imposing such strict standards. As a result, the people in that state which has imposed such restrictions, which has imposed such Peruvian tax, this state will see decline, will lose the opportunity of hosting that particular firm which would have generated employment in that state. And this will lead to political pressure not to enforce the standards so strictly. Okay, so these are the issues. The second approach, so Peruvian tax is one approach to internalize the prices, internalize the externality into the price system. The second approach to internalize the externalities into the price system is that of cap and trade. Okay? Cap and trade. Cap and trade basically means you are issuing emission licenses. License or permit. Each license or permit entitles you to some amount of pollution. So, if you have one permit, you can emit that much. This type of licenses are can be sold to other parties. The amount of license, since one license corresponds to some given amount of emission, the total amount of licenses issued would also mean some amount of emissions. Generally, the licenses are issued in such a number that the total amount of pollutants permissible is less than the prevailing level of pollution. Okay, how does it affect the market? It affects the market in the following way. If there are licenses, if my firm is emitting beyond the if my firm is emitting the pollutants, I can continue with production only if I have the license. For that, I have to spend an amount. Okay, and that acts as a deterrent, because obviously if I'm spending an amount, it will be reflected in my cost. Okay, so my price will be high, and if price is high, then obviously my demand for my product will decline. So I suffer that way. So it gives me an incentive to reduce my emission standards. As I reduce my emission standards, my costs go down on one hand. At the same time, I can sell it to some other party. Okay, which in turn gives me some revenue. So I have an incentive here. So you can see, just by selling the pollution permit, the government has another way of internalizing the costs. Okay? Apart from labor, other factors of production and raw material, the additional cost that the firm has to incur now is the one involved in procuring the permit for emission. So it becomes a part of the private cost now, and as it becomes a part of private cost, it is reflected in the market mechanism. Okay, we have seen the cases of social cost. Then similarly, consumption externalities, there can also be positive externalities. Positive externalities. So suppose let's think of positive consumption externalities. Positive consumption externalities. What are positive consumption externalities? Positive consumption externalities mean if I'm consuming something, the gain to the overall society will be much more than the gain, the personal gain to me. And in such a situation, the gain that I am making is less than the gain to the overall society. And therefore, the price that I'll be willing to pay for buying that commodity will be less than the one that I would be willing to pay if I had all the gains that are being accrued, are being reaped by the society. Okay. In such a situation, as we have seen, the demand curve, actual demand curve, private demand curve, which is just based on the marginal private benefits, will lie below the demand curve that would exist if the demand curve had internalized the social benefits. Okay, so the position of demand curve will be lower than the socially desirable level, and therefore the quantum of production would be less than the socially desirable level. Okay, how can it be internalized? Again, just as we can shift the supply curve upwards by giving production subsidies, by imposing production taxes, we can internalize the gains to the person by giving by giving subsidies. Okay. If we are giving subsidies, that means the gain to you, if you are consuming that good and the government is giving you subsidy for consuming that, the gain to you is more than your private gain just by consuming that commodity. Okay, it could be like education, it could be like vaccination. And if the gains to you is high, then obviously you'll be willing to pay a higher price. If you know that by just consuming this thing, government is going to give you 1,000 rupees, then you will be willing to pay a much higher price than you were paying before. And therefore the demand curve would shift upwards. And as the demand curve shifts upwards, with the given supply curve, as the demand curve shifts upwards, the quantity produced would rise. Okay. With associated two important cases associated with externalities are that of merit goods and demerit goods. These are the cases where there are certain goods which are private in nature, but the levels of externalities associated with them are in the nature of public goods. Okay, there are private goods which have so huge externalities that it is beneficial for the government to intervene in the market. Okay, so the idea of merit goods is that substantial in the consumption of such goods. We have already seen the examples yesterday. It means the education. If you are getting education today, you are getting education, but it will also affect the society at large. Similarly, vaccination against infectious diseases. If you are getting immunized yourself against, if you are getting immunized against the infectious, if you are getting immunized against infectious diseases, it is not just you who will benefit, but it is the entire society that will benefit, because you are immunized. You will not catch that disease, and if you are not affected, then obviously you will contribute. You will not become the means of spread of that disease. So it is beneficial to the entire society. So this type, imagine if there is a fast spreading disease, which you can understand these days very well, what it means to have immunity against that. So if the people are immunized against that, the spread will be controlled. And if the spread is controlled, it is gain to the entire society. In such a situation, the private gains, the social gains are huge, and therefore, in order to encourage people for getting immunized against this, government may give subsidies. So some vaccination, which would cost 5,000 rupees, government will say, okay, out of 5,000, we will bear a part of it, let me say 2,000, 3,000 rupees, but let's be let's give them some incentive, and as the people are given incentive, they will more like getting immunized. Okay, or in general, good public health. And of course, there are additional reasons for government intervention in such situations. I have already discussed in the beginning of today's lecture about the information problems associated with the health issues. So one generally doesn't know as to which hospital is better. And in such a situation, it becomes important for the government to provide such things. Okay? And that gives us another thing. These goods are private, these are excludable, so you have to pay the price for that, so market demand exists. But since the externalities are large, the amount in which the market would produce such things, if the market were to be left to itself, would be less than the socially desirable level. And therefore, the government has to intervene. The government can intervene either by providing subsidies or by providing it itself. Number one. Number two, not just the quantity in which it is being provided, there are other reasons why the government may have to intervene. One example I have already given you. One is the case of information problems, which is this thing. Information problems. The information about such things is not easily available as to which hospital, which nursing home provides better facilities here. Secondly, even if the nursing homes are providing such facilities in a good quality, the issue of who gets access to this becomes important. Okay, the price which is being charged for such things may not be such that everyone can afford them, and therefore it becomes. And since these are important, the consumption has such positive externalities. It becomes important for the government to make it affordable. I have already talked about this. If a vaccine is costing 5,000 rupees, not everyone may be able to afford it. How can the government do it? Government can provide a subsidy so that on every unit of the vaccine, one gets rupees 4,000 subsidy. Rupees 1,000 is obviously much more accessible than rupees 5,000 to anyone. Or maybe the government can intervene itself and provide it free of cost in the government hospitals. That is another thing. You must have heard Government of India had launched massive immunization program in the 20th century, and that helped us overcome the spread of many diseases among children and adults. Okay, so this has to be done because the social gains to the society are much larger than the private gains. Okay, and one important issue is about uncertainty and as to when such need will arise. On health issues in particular, health in general is a good with a positive externality. If you are healthy, the gains of the society will be huge. Okay, but if there are the health issues, as you know, there are uncertainties associated with the health issues. When the health issues will arise, no one knows. Okay, and when the health issues are arising, you may not have enough purchasing power to buy the health services. That is another reason why the government. So the point here is the basic issue here is that merit goods are the goods such that their consumption has the goods themselves are private commodities in the sense that they are excludable. So and they are rivalrous. If you are getting vaccinated, then obviously with the same vaccine, someone else can also not. So there has to be new unit of the vaccine. So to them, to that extent, it is also an anti-virus rule. It is excludable. Anti-virus excludable, divisible. So these are public. These are private goods. But then, even though the demand curve exists, the quantities in which these are produced are suboptimal if left to the market, and therefore government has to intervene. And there are additional reasons why the government has to intervene in the provision of such goods. Just opposite to the merit goods are the demerit goods. Demerit goods have substantial negative externalities. So these are similar to the merit goods. The difference is that while the externalities associated with the merit goods are positive, the externalities associated with the demerit goods are negative. Okay, so just as the government needs to encourage the consumption of the merit goods, government needs to, in the same manner, discourage the consumption of the demerit goods. And again, the government uses a number of types of mechanisms which are discussed at length in your book. I will not go into much detail, but government can, for instance, there could be direct measures. Government could impose the government could impose a complete ban on the consumption of such commodities. One very good example of this is the cigarettes. We have discussed yesterday, and you all know very well what are the negative consequences to the society if you are smoking. Okay, the government may put a complete ban on the sale of such commodities. The other option is for the government to launch advertising campaigns through which people can be made aware of the negative consequences of such things. Okay, or there could be restrictions about the sale and use of such substances in the most vulnerable areas like hospitals, like educational institutions, and so on. But these are all non-market controls. The market controls would be, for instance, to impose a tax. One very good example of this is the GST. You must have heard when the GST was designed, in the largest tax bracket, the commodities were mostly which were the demerit goods. Okay, the idea is, we have already seen, if there are demerit goods, then suppose a person is drawing some, just as in case of positive consumption externality, the demand curve is less than the demand curve which reflects only the marginal private benefit. This is lower than the marginal social benefit. And in case of goods with negative consumption externalities, the marginal social benefit is less than the marginal private benefit, and therefore the actual demand curve, which is optimal from the society's point of view, will lie below the individual's demand curve. Okay. If we want to internalize the mechanism, what you can do is we can impose a heavy tax on this thing. As a result, the marginal benefit to the consumer will decline. So that is the market mechanism. The other option for the government would be that the government can put a price ceiling. Okay? As a result, the price is very high. This can be seen with the help of a diagram. Let me show you just the diagram in your book instead of drawing it myself, because the diagram in the book is quite clear. New diagram is not required. Look at this. This is the marginal private benefit. This is the marginal social benefit. I have already said that marginal social benefit will lie below the marginal private benefit. Okay, this is the marginal social cost as well private cost, because the externalities are arising in consumption and not in production. So cost is not affected. It is only the benefit that is affected. Now it can be seen the production level from the society's point, which is optimal from the society's point of view, is this one. But the one which is optimal from the individual's point of view is this one. This is what is being produced. Okay, because it is the marginal private benefit which is determining the demand curve. As a result, the socially desirable level is above the market production level is above the socially desirable level. One way for the government to control this would be that this is the price, at this price, this is the consumption level. Government knows that if given the negative demand curve, if the government raises the price, then you will move along this curve. As the price rises, the demand will decline. So the government can fix the price if the government thinks that this level of production is too much. And this is the socially desirable level. One way for the government would be to impose the price ceiling. So that if this is the price level, socially desirable level determined by the marginal social benefit curve, government looks at the price value on the marginal private benefit curve, at which the demand would be brought to the socially desirable level, and government can fix the price to that level, the minimum price to that level. Okay, if the price cannot be brought below this, if the price is above this, the demand will be further lower. The level of production will be further lower. But then at this level, the level of production is equal to the socially desirable level. So that is another way the government can do it. But then there are issues with the design of this. One is, of course, the social cost. We have already seen that there are problems in measuring the social costs and benefits. And therefore, since this minimum price is determined looking at this marginal social benefit curve, which is determined looking at the marginal social marginal cost to the society from consumption of such commodities, this gap can be determined, this value of price can be determined only if this gap can be ascertained, which is very difficult, number one. Number two, we have seen the case of inelastic goods. If the demand curve, just imagine the situation where this demand curve is steep. Instead of being like this, it is very steep. In that case, you can see, if this tax, the given amount of tax will not reduce the quantity that much. So a huge tax would be required even for marginal decline. Okay. Third point, such heavy taxes or such measures lead to another problem. These lead to illegal activities. Okay, and illegal in the sense that these lead to underground activities. If these goods cannot be bought at a reasonable price in the open market, then some underground markets develop in which these are sold without the knowledge of the authorities. Okay, unreported activities that we considered yesterday. So the point here is the presence of negative externalities associated with the consumption of demerit goods necessitates the government intervention in order to bring the consumption of such commodities to socially desirable levels. And there are several tools for this, namely the taxes, the minimum prices, and so on. Okay, but then such actions have their own limitations. That is the summary of what we have discussed during the last 10 minutes. Okay, then next reason for market failure was the public goods. So we need to now discuss the issue of public goods, government intervention in case of the public goods. Public goods depend on whether the market demand curve doesn't exist at all or whether it exists but is not perfect. It depends on that. Okay, there are certain situations in which demand curve do not exist because the goods are completely non-excludable. For instance, okay, we have seen the case of pure public goods. They are completely non-excludable, completely non-rivalrous, completely indivisible. In that case, the market demand curve doesn't exist. If the market demand curve doesn't exist, the market cannot provide them at all, let alone the socially desirable quantities. And if the market cannot provide them at all, and the government also, then number one, market cannot provide, government has to provide. Number two, the government has to provide. There are certain activities for which demand curve does exist. So government can think of levying user charges on that. But if the demand curve does not exist, then even government cannot think of levying user charges for that. And this is the case for your public goods. And if the user charges cannot be levied, then the government has to provide such things and finance such services by the general budget, general government tax revenues. Okay, so for this reason, the public goods for which the fee cannot be charged, such goods, so pure public goods, have to be provided government on the general tax revenues. But then there are others for which the demand curve does exist, and in such situation, the government can think of providing them. So the other impure public goods, some of them are can be provided by the government and the market. But it is possible that the levels of production, if these were to be left to the private sector, would not be socially optimal. And therefore, the government may have to intervene in order to bring the levels of production of such activities to socially desirable level. Okay? We have seen cases where like education and health, where the government may have to intervene. Okay? Or the government may have to intervene either by providing it itself or giving more incentive to the private sector to provide it. There is another type of thing which cannot be left to private sector at all. For example, due to security concerns. Such as atomic energy. Okay, atomic energy, this can, of course, for instance, look at the nuclear power plants. Nuclear power plants generate electricity. Electricity is bought by all of us. And our electricity is that way in the nature of public good. It is divisible, it is excludable, it is rivalrous. So it has all the properties of a public good. And therefore the nuclear power can be provided by the private sector. But you know the hazards associated with the nuclear energy. And therefore, despite the fact that this can be provided by the public sector, it cannot be left to the market only. The other is that of scientific drug trials. Drugs are manufactured in the private sector, and once a drug is manufactured, the drug trials can take place in the public sector. Okay, but once a drug is invented, the trials can take place in the private sector. But the problem is, if the private sector proceeds on the basis of profit motive, and if there is some private body which is conducting such trials, it can raise its profits by slightly loosening the standards to make it beneficial for one party which invented this medicine. It will lead to higher profits for the testing party, that party which is doing drug trials. But you can understand the consequences of this loosening of standards for the public health general in the economy. And therefore, in such a situation, it is not desirable for the government to leave the drug trials to the private sector. Okay. Other things are regulation. We can see that the regulation in financial markets, in the regulation, it is important to have regulation in different markets for various reasons. The regulation again cannot be left to the private sector, because private sector is governed by the profit motive, and therefore the regulation has to be provided for by the government, another rule the government has. Okay. Of course, the intervention for the government in such cases can take various forms. One important type of intervention that we have not studied so far, but it is very common, is the price interventions of various forms. One practical private intervention is that of agricultural commodities. Agricultural commodities prices tend to fluctuate heavily. Okay, there are various models in agriculture economics for that. I will not go into details of that, but you can understand. Agricultural commodity prices tend to fluctuate very heavily, and that creates some disincentive for the farmers. Okay, and in order to ensure that the farmers are adequately compensated for the production, one scheme with which the government has come out is the minimum support price. If the government is coming out with the minimum support price, then what happens is that the government is willing to procure that particular commodity for which the minimum support price is applicable. Like it is wheat, it is rice. So for these commodities, the MSP or the minimum support price is applicable. If there is no certainty provided by the government that it will buy whatever output is produced at some price, then people may be discouraged from producing these commodities. Okay, because one doesn't know. You spend so much in producing this commodity, and by the time the crop comes to the market, please keep in mind, agricultural production has a gestation period. So you are sowing the crop in the month of November, and the crop will come to the market only in the month of February, March. There may be a massive change in the price in the market. Okay, prices in the market can change very fast within a span of days. So you found a very high price for, say, wheat in the month of November. Accordingly, you decided to sow in a larger area. But then by the time the crop came to the market in the month of April or February, in March, the prices have crashed. And going by this uncertainty, next time you may decide not to sow wheat. And you can understand, if there is shortage of wheat in the economy, what happens? So what the government does, the government has a scheme of something called minimum support price. This is another type of scheme that support that the government does. What is minimum support price? Minimum support price is the price which the government, minimum price at which the government procures the food grain from the market. Okay, if it is not sold in the market. So the idea is that the person who is sowing wheat knows that if it is not sold in the market, I can sell it to the government. And that gives an incentive to the person to keep sowing that commodity, which is so crucial for the economy. Then there are other commodities for consumption wise, the government cannot afford to their prices to keep rising. For instance, the fuels meant for kitchen. So there are certain people who have very low price, who have very low incomes. They use, for instance, suppose, of course, now the government has given cylinders under several schemes, but look at the scenario of 5 years back. That was not that much prevalent. People used to use kerosene mainly, apart from firewood. So government used to provide such commodities at a lower price. Anyway, information failure is the final thing that we have seen. There are several types of mechanisms from the government side to ensure that the correct information is conveyed to the buyers regarding the product being purchased. It could mean correct labeling of the products, giving all the information in the label. It could mean running advertisement campaigns. One good example of this is, you must have seen alerts by the government regarding the fake universities during last several months last year. Okay. So through its advertisement campaigns, labeling, advertisement campaigns, and a regulation on advertisement, etc., government can ensure that correct information is conveyed. Okay. Then there is question of distribution, but distribution I'll discuss when I discuss fiscal policy, which is my next topic now. I would suggest to take a quick look at this and give me just 2 minutes in the meanwhile. Finally, the topic on fiscal policy. Fiscal policy, as we have said, is the policy of the government through the use of tools of budget such as government revenue, government expenditure, etc. We have discussed yesterday various tools of fiscal policy with the objectives of fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is about the use of the government tools to stabilize the economy and achieve other objectives. The objectives of the fiscal policy include A, the achievement of full employment and maintenance of that. It means price stability, which means low and stable inflation. It also, the other additional role that the government takes is that of promoting economic growth. Business cycles means stabilization of employment around the full employment level, but we also need to raise the level of the rate of economic growth, the rate at which the output grows over the years. Okay, so cyclical fluctuations is one thing, and the trend growth is another thing. Economic stability is about stabilizing the business cycles, but economic growth is about raising the rate of growth, the trend growth. Okay, and finally, the equitable distribution of income and wealth, which is falls under the distribution function. Okay, now before I start, let me talk a little bit about the difference between the automatic stabilizers and discretionary fiscal policy. Okay, as far as the issue of business cycle, as far as the issue of stabilization is concerned, there can be two types of policy. One is discretionary fiscal policy, about which we will study here. Other is suppose the economy is into recession. Of course, the government may need to take discretionary policy actions, and what type of policy actions that can be taken by the government, we'll come to that later. First question is, are there some inbuilt automatic stabilizers which would prevent the output from declining or rising too much in the face of shocks? The answer is yes. There are some automatic stabilizers due to which automatically the output is stabilized. That doesn't fluctuate that much. This is basically about inbuilt tax or expenditure mechanisms. Without going into mathematics, if you want, I can show you mathematics also. But let me try to explain it through words, because I think for many of you it would be better. It would be easier if I try to explain simply through words. Think of a case of rise in autonomous expenditure. AD autonomous. We have seen that it has multiplier effect on GDP. Okay, we have seen yesterday. Now there are certain inbuilt stabilizers in the economy. One stabilizer is the tax. We call it progressive tax. Tax which is a positive function of income. Okay, this acts as an automatic stabilizer. How does it act as an automatic stabilizer? Please remember, AD is C plus I plus G. Ignore the openness for a while, and C is Y minus T, disposable income. Now, if the tax varies with positively with income, look at what happens. Just think about it a little bit. Due to rise in, say, I bar, income is rising. Okay, or let me look at an adverse shock. I bar has declined. So let's think of recession. So I bar has declined, or maybe C bar has declined, the autonomous expenditure on consumption, let's say A, has declined, due to which there will be decline in aggregate demand. And this decline in aggregate demand will have multiplier effect, as we have seen yesterday. The effect of shocks is magnified. Effect of shocks on the equilibrium level of GDP is magnified by the presence of the multiplier effect, as we have seen yesterday. If the multiplier effect can be reduced, then the fluctuations in output can be much less violent, okay, much less pronounced. And a tax which is a positive function of income achieves precisely that. How? Let us see. As income is rising, as due to a decline in I bar, your output, your income, output and income rises. But as income is rising, if tax is a positive function of income, then as income declines, then tax also declines. So Y is declining, but T is also declining. And therefore, as Y declines, T does not decline that much. T also, and therefore, disposable much as it would decline in T. Okay, and if disposable income is not declining that much, then AD will not decline that much. And therefore, Y will not decline that much. Let me repeat, as due to an adverse demand shock, that is decline in autonomous demand, as there is a decline in Y, T is declining because T is a positive function of Y, which means as Y rises, T rises, Y declines, T declines. So as Y is declining, T is declining. So even though Y is declining, Y minus T is not declining that much. Okay, to give you a more concrete example, suppose T is equal to say 0.25 or 0.2 times Y. Suppose what happens as income declines, tax also declines. So the YD is equal to Y minus 0.2 Y is equal to 0.8 Y. So as income suppose declines by 100 units, suppose aggregate demand declines by 100 units, in this case YD will decline only by 80 units. So consumption will not decline as much. As consumption does not decline that much, aggregate demand doesn't decline overall that much. Please remember this multiplier effect comes through this changes in C at subsequent stages. Since income depends on disposable income, and as Y declines, the decline in tax means the disposable income doesn't decline that much, the multiplier effect will be much smaller. And as the multiplier effect is much smaller, the overall declining equilibrium income will be much smaller. Therefore, the recession will not lead to that much decline in income levels. Okay. Similarly, by just the opposite of this, you can imagine this also means that when there is a positive demand shock, it will not lead to that much rise in the level of equilibrium level of income. Okay, so this tax which varies positively with income is another example, is one example of automatic stabilizer. Another example is that of unemployment, is example of subsidies income levels. One example of this is unemployment allowances. Again, think of an adverse demand shock due to which Y declines, AD declines, so Y declines. Okay, but as Y declines, your unemployment rises. Therefore, unemployment allowance rises. Therefore, disposable income. Please remember, disposable income is equal to private income minus tax. And private income is national income minus income that is earned but not received, plus income that is received but not earned, like transfer payments, like unemployment allowances. So as a result, again, as Y rises, YD does not decline that much. And as aggregate, there is an adverse demand shock due to which output declines, so unemployment rises. Due to rise in unemployment allowances rise. And therefore, this has effect similar to that of a tax, which is a positive function of income. There, in that case, as the income decline, transfer payment, the tax also declines, so disposable income doesn't decline as much. Here, as the Y is declining, transfer payments are rising. Okay, so even though the actual income the national income is declining, the disposable personal income is rising, because this allowance is a part of disposable income, personal disposable income through the personal income, as we have seen. So disposable income does not decline that much. Okay. So these are automatic stabilizers. But then in many cases, the automatic stabilizers are not sufficient and government has to intervene in order to influence the level of employment and output. So then we come to the discretionary policy, fiscal policy. Discretionary fiscal policy, which is the deliberate actions of the government. Affect the level of Y, P, etc. How does the government do it? Please remember, in the Keynesian model, output depends on aggregate demand, which is equal to C plus I plus G plus MX. Government can affect consumption through taxes, disposable income, transfer payments. Government can affect investment by providing incentives for investment. Investment tax credit is one such thing. When the government gives some incentive through giving some exemptions on certain types of investment. Government expenditure is directly in the hands of the government, and then net exports by giving incentives to exports. Government can affect the net exports. Okay, what are the tools at the disposal of the government? There are 4 tools we can see. One is the government expenditure. Other is the government revenue, in particular tax revenue. Third is the government. Of course, this is effectively the above only. Revenue minus expenditure. Expenditure minus revenue is what the budget deficit means, and then the government debt. Okay. First of all, look at government expenditure. Expenditure means current and private. The current and capital expenditure and transfer payments, which includes mainly subsidies. Okay, current expenditure, as I discussed yesterday, current expenditure is the expenditure in the day-to-day revenue of the government. In order to run its establishment, which includes the administrative machinery, the general government, the defense establishments, the defense forces, paramilitary forces, internal security mechanism, including police, etc. The other institutions that government has, like government universities, government research institutions, government hospitals, etc. The expenditure that is incurred in running this type of establishments is called the government current expenditure. Other is the capital expenditure. The capital expenditure, as you know, is basically about creation of assets. Which includes, for instance, the bridges, highways, ports, airports, etc. So, so basically equipment infrastructure, and third is the transfer payments. As you know, the government expenditure has a multiplier effect. So one way the government can influence the aggregate spending in the economy is by affecting its government expenditure. Okay. Please keep in mind the current expenditure is only due to the running of the government, and which is more or less fixed. It is determined by the size of the government. But capital expenditure is something that government can change slightly more with much more ease. We will see how the government can use this in a short while. Let's first look at the tools. The second is the taxes. Government can use various types of taxes to affect economic activity. For instance, look at the direct tax, look at the income tax. So this the government can affect the disposable income, which will affect the consumption expenditure, which affect the aggregate demand. Okay, that is one way government can do it. If the government reduces the disposable income, if the government reduces the income taxes, that will lead to more disposable income in the hands of people. They will be able to spend more, and that will lead to rise in aggregate demand. So during the recessions, the government can use this tool by recessions. Okay, the other is the corporate tax. Again, corporate taxes, if the government reduces the corporate taxes, then the firm's earnings post-tax are higher, and therefore they have more resources available for making investment. So reduction in private taxes leads to rise in investment. You must have seen that just a few months back, government did make some big changes to the corporate tax structure. Then public debt. In order to understand the public debt, we need to look at the behavior of interest rates. The behavior of interest rate will be discussed in more detail in the next topic. But for now, let me just try to give you a rough idea of how it might be useful. See, the income that people are earning is going to either consumption or savings, and the savings are then taken away by the government for its budget, or it is taken away by the private sector for investment. Okay. Now, if the government budget deficit is high, government will need to borrow. So, government is running budget deficit. Government will needs to borrow. How can it borrow? It can borrow from the market, and of course, it can borrow through small savings scheme of the post office and banks. Okay. Keeping that aside, or even including that, what happens if the government is borrowing heavily? The demand for funds in the market is more, which leads to rise in the prices for funds. The interest rate. As interest rate is rising, what happens? On one hand, investment is unfortunately I cannot discuss in this course because it is not in your syllabus and I don't have time. Otherwise, I would have still liked to spend some time discussing that because that's a crucial relation. When we discuss stabilization, the dependence of investment and consumption on interest rate becomes important. But I hope through your other papers, you know very well that investment is a negative function of interest rate. As there is a rise in interest rate, there is a decline in investment. Okay, so as the government is borrowing heavily, there is a rise in rate of interest. This rise in rate of interest leads to decline in investment because investment is a negative function of rate of interest. Okay. Number one. Number two, as the interest rates are rising, this is not discussed here, but consumption also depends negatively on the rate of interest because savings is a positive function. If interest rates are rising, you have an incentive to save today and consume later. So consumption is that way declining. So the point is, if the government budget is very high, it leads to pressure on the rate of interest, which leads to decline in investment consumption and consumption. Okay, this decline in investment due to rise in government budget deficit is called crowding out. And that's an important issue with fiscal policy. If the government is using government, we have seen that as there is a rise in government expenditure, it leads to rise in the equilibrium level of income through multiplier effect. So one way for the government to affect the level of output in the economy is by raising G. Another option is to reduce T. Government reduces T, disposable income rises, and through the rise in disposable income, the aggregate demand rises because consumption rises. So either it is a rise in G or it is a decline in T. Both of these lead to a rise in aggregate demand and therefore income. But this either the budget deficit is equal to government expenditure minus government revenue. This revenue is mainly tax revenue, but there are also heads of non-tax revenue for the government, like the user charges for the facilities that the government provides, like government schools, government hospitals, etc. The proceeds from disinvestment, the incomes of the other enterprises that the government runs, and so on. Okay, so the difference between the government expenditure and government revenue is the budget deficit. How does the government meet it? The government makes the budget deficit by borrowing, so it leads to debt. Government debt. So when the government runs deficit, it leads to government debt. Okay, because the government meets this deficit by borrowing. Okay, and as the government is borrowing, it leads to pressure in the rate of interest, and that leads to decline in investment. So we say the rise in government expenditure has crowded out private expenditure, and that is the reason the government deficits are not in a way not high budget deficit by the government is not regarded as a positive thing by the market. Markets generally prefer lower budget deficit by the government. The other way of looking at it would be that whether it is the government which is borrowing or whether it is the government which is borrowing or the firms which are borrowing for making investment, they are borrowing. This borrowing is simply they are borrowing from the savings of the household sector. And so whatever savings there, if the government is borrowing more, then obviously the amount of funds left for borrowing by the private sector will be less. And you can say, okay, if the interest rates are rising, savings will rise. So then it will not be from the fixed chunk of funds. But then if savings are rising, that means consumption is declining. So that is also declining aggregate demand. So either way, the heavy government borrowing, which happens due to heavy budget deficit, will lead to declining private spending. We say, in general, a rise in government's budget deficit crowds out the private expenditure. Okay. Now, what are the types of fiscal policy? This is something which if you understand the aggregate demand, aggregate supply framework well, it should not take you much time. We talk about expansion fiscal policies aimed at raising Y, and contraction fiscal policies about reducing Y. That is the basic idea. Okay, think of a recession. Let me try if I can explain you with the help of the diagrams which are there in your book, so that we don't need to spend time on the diagrams. Look at this. No, I think better I make my diagram. Suppose this is the initial aggregate demand curve and this is the initial aggregate supply curve. Okay. Now suppose due to whatever reason, maybe decline in autonomous investment, the aggregate demand curve shifts to this position. Here we are measuring output and here we are measuring the price level. Now you can see due to this adverse demand shock, the level of output in the economy declines from this level to this level and the level of prices declines. Okay, this the economy has entered into recession. Okay, what can the government do? In this case, the government needs to raise the government expenditure. Okay, government needs to use expansionary fiscal policy in such a situation. How will expansionary fiscal policy help and what type of policy options does the government have? Government can, for instance, in this case, use the cut in taxes. You know very well that if the government goes for a cut in tax, it will lead to rise in disposable income. As a result, consumption will rise and therefore aggregate demand will rise. So this cut in tax will lead to outward shift of the aggregate demand curve. The idea is if you want to attain back this level, this is my this yellow line represents the full employment level of output or the long-term aggregate supply curve as given in your book. If the government can shift this aggregate demand curve back to this position where it comes here, then the economy will be back at full employment level. Of course, there are mechanisms at work due to which if the government does not do anything, gradually the economy will reach this level of output. But then that will take a lot of time. Okay? And that is the reason it is imperative for the government, it is desirable for the government to take a policy action to bring the economy back to this level. Okay, and the government can do it by either cutting taxes, which will lead to rise in consumption, or by raising government expenditure. Okay, we know that rise in government expenditure leads to aggregate demand. So either way, so in this case, cutting taxes or raising government expenditure would be this means cut taxes or raise government expenditure. On the other hand, this would mean expansionary fiscal policy, expand the level of output from the level of output which exists now. Then look at the contractionary fiscal policy. Contractionary fiscal policy is about reducing the level of output. For this, let me come to this. Suppose now, let this diagram stay here so that you can see it. Suppose there is a positive demand shock as a result of which the economy moves to this position. Okay? You may note in this case the output is higher. Of course, no one would dislike the higher output. Higher output means lower unemployment. That means more employment than would prevail under the full employment levels. Okay, but then this means that the price level is higher. This price level is higher than this price level. Okay, so level of output above the full employment level comes at higher price level, comes with higher prices, which of course neither of us would like. Okay, so this is the position. Again, if the economy is left to itself, gradually the economy will come back to this full employment level, but that again will take a lot of time. We will have to face a prolonged phase of high prices, which one would not like. So what is required, desired here is that this government brings this diagram back to this level. Okay, this happens through cut in aggregate demand. How can the government cut aggregate demand? It may raise taxes. Government raises tax. Higher tax means lower disposable income, therefore lower consumption. Okay, that will lead to leftward shifting of this demand curve. And so government should do it in such a manner that it comes back to this level. On the other hand, if the government wants to do it through government expenditure, it needs to cut government expenditure. So both of these are examples of contractionary fiscal policy. And this happens through either rising taxes or in G. Okay, this is broadly a summary of what is discussed here. There are three important other issues left in fiscal policy. Let me quickly go through those. In the meanwhile, if you have any questions, please do keep posting questions. Before I proceed to money, I'll take your questions. First, the government policies. Long-run economic growth. Long-run economic growth, you already know very well what long-run economic growth means. Let's just very quickly discuss what the government can do to promote this. In order to just make the point, let me write so that you can understand it quickly. Aggregate output is given by this production function at the simplest possible level. Output is determined by capital stock, labor, both are factors of production, and this is an indicator of technology of production. Okay. Now, given the labor growth, labor is determined by population mainly, and the policy by the government to promote participation by people in the labor force. Okay. But then we have this K and L, K and A. If there is more technology to work with, the same laborers will be able to produce more output. So one thing that the government needs to do is to promote capital accumulation. That means more investment, encourage investment in physical capital. That is one thing the government can do. Okay, and which means the government, and you know what is required for doing promoting investment. Government should, for instance, providing for. There are several things which you will find in other books. I don't think I have enough time to go into that now. Point is, government should take steps so that K rises over time. In K, which happens with investment. So promoting investment is one thing. Second is rise in A. This is called technological progress. Now it is almost everywhere accepted that in the long run, economic growth can sustain itself. Economy can keep growing sustainably without any external intervention, only if there is a sustained technological progress. Okay, there is sustained innovation. New technology is being discovered on a regular basis. Okay, and this requires research and development. Which means the government needs to give incentives for research and development. Okay, and also promote research and development. So government can do it through providing subsidies for research. Have research in government research institutions. Then there are other mechanisms which incentivize research. And one very good mechanism is that of patent. You know very well what patent means. Patent means that, just think about it, if there is some manufacturer of new medicine who has invested a lot of effort in a lot of resources in developing a new medicine. Okay, once the medicine is coming to the market, other people copy the formula and start producing the same medicine. Now imagine if it is being produced at large scale by other people, this particular manufacturer will not be able to reap the benefits. On the other hand, if this particular, we have seen in case of monopoly that if you have the monopoly, you can charge a higher price. The price that can be charged it is possible to charge a higher price than marginal cost, which is required when you have to incur heavy initial cost in discovering the medicine. So you can I'm just taking the example of medicine as one example of how new research is required, what are the features of new research. Before a new product comes into the market or new technology comes into the market, a lot of research is required. Several months, years of research is required, which includes includes a lot of expenditure. So in order to make it viable, you have to provide some mechanism through which you can charge a higher price for a few years after the product comes into the market. And that is guaranteed by patent that, okay, for next few 10 or 20 years, you will have the monopoly in the production of that. Okay, in the absence of a patent, once you come out with the product, you spend millions of rupees in invention of a new drug, and once it comes to the market, someone else copies the formula and starts producing it. And since the other person is charging a lower price, you have to reduce your price. And as you reduce your price, your profits are not as high, which would allow you to recover the huge cost that you have incurred during the last few years in discovering that drug. So patent becomes important, and patent is just one example of a larger thing called the institutional framework. Government has to provide institutions to promote growth. Okay, I do not think I can say much more here, given the paucity of time. So, what you would like to hear at this point, I think is more than covers what I'm to say on growth front. Finally, look at the stabilization function. Sorry, distribution function. Distribution function is about, as we have already seen, is about fairness, equity. What can the government do? How can the government use its policy tools in order to promote equity and efficiency? There are several things, like a progressive direct tax system, and combined with the income transfers or other schemes for the poor. So progressive income tax means the people who are richer pay higher rate of tax. As you know, in India, at initial, you know it very well because you did in taxes also. At lower income levels, the tax rate is low, but as you successively move to higher income levels, the marginal tax rates go on rising. So as a result, the richer need to pay more, and the people who are not that much rich need to pay lower taxes. Okay, so that would ensure, and using these resources, you can transfer incomes to the people. If you have noted during last 4 or 5 weeks, the government has said that it will be transferring some amounts to the people who have lost their employment due to this lockdown. Okay, so the people don't have any jobs, they don't have any income. So in order to make sure that they have enough income to make their both ends meet, they are being given income by the government. Okay, income transfers. Then the government runs other schemes for the poor, which would, for instance, give them free or subsidized food, medical care, education. The medical care, the public hospitals which have free facilities by the free consultation by the doctors is one example. And then there are states in India, for instance Rajasthan, where the tests are available free of cost to the poor section of the society. So you need to have a card called BPL card, that you are below the poverty line. And then people who are holders of that card can get the tests done without any cost. So even a test which would otherwise cost 5,000 rupees in the market, but the hospital would charge 2,000 rupees, can be availed free of cost in the government hospitals in some states. Okay, for the people who have that BPL card, which is made on the basis of verification of their income. So this is another example of this. And then things such as old age pension, unemployment allowances, okay. Then government can provide essential goods, as I have already seen. I have seen subsidized food, provision of certain items, subsidized basis, such as you must have heard, cylinders at subsidized prices, sugar, etc. in ration shops, etc. Okay, and of course, one very good example of this is MNREGA. which provides employment to these people for 100 days in a year. So if you are getting 110 rupees for 100 days a year, you get some income. Okay, very quickly, let's discuss the limitations of fiscal policy. All we have done, we have seen that okay, in case of recession, government can take government policy action in order to bring the economy back on track, and government can also take other actions to bring fairness to the distribution. All these things we have studied, but then there are practical problems associated with that, and one big problem associated with the one big problem is that of lags. There are various types of lags involved. Let me take example of a recession. Suppose there is a recession setting in. Okay, is it that easy that okay, government sees that okay, there is a recession, let's take quick action, and immediately government takes action, and there is the aggregate demand curve is brought back to the same level? It may appear simple here, but it is not actually so. First of all, in order to see that there is a recession, we need data on variables such as employment, output, and prices. And these data, reliable data, become available only after a lag. GDP data for India, for instance, become available after huge lags. And the most common data, the most high frequency data available for us is the industrial production data that is available on a monthly basis. But even those data come with a lag of weeks, several weeks. And that could be the first sign for you that the industry is entering that economic activity is slowing down. Okay, one indicator I'm just saying. Okay, prices. Price data again become available with a lag. And of course, in diagnosis of a problem, data is a problem. Data is the first step. Data available become with a lag. Once the data have become available, you need to analyze. Because of course I cannot discuss it here, but the output can decline either due to demand side shocks or supply side shocks. And you cannot use one type of same type of remedy for both the types of shocks. In fact, if it is caused by supply shock and you take an action which would be suitable in case of demand shock, it can further exacerbate the problem in some way. So you have to identify what is the problem. Just as before taking an action, a doctor needs to be clear as to what is causing this given health of the patient. So we have to have data. Then we have to the analysts need to sit together and see what is the problem. They need to recognize the nature of the problem. Then they need to decide. Looking at the diagnosis of the problem, what type of action needs to be taken. Once this action has been taken, please remember we are talking about fiscal policy, expenditure and revenue of the government. And any change in that can be approved only by the parliament. So there is a legislative process. Okay, beyond the limit, if there is a limit, there is a change, it has to be passed by the parliament, which itself obviously would take time. Okay, once the change has been announced, it takes time before it takes effect. And the time it takes, once the government has, so suppose we say that the tax needs to be cut by this much. Fine. We need to realize that there is a recession. Data come, we look at the data, we realize there is a recession. And after analyzing everything, the government decides that yes, we need to cut the taxes. And the government gets it and is able to get it passed by the parliament. Okay. Or suppose the government, it's not even that required due to some provision. Once it is announced, is implemented, it will take several months before it actually shows up in the variables of interest. And that itself shows another challenge. These lags in implementation are long and variable. To see how it, to an extreme case, why it might be a problem, look at this diagram. Suppose economy entered into a recession. Aggregate demand curve was here. We know that we need to push it to this point. By the time the data became available and you recognize that there is a problem, you decided the policy action. The policy action was legislated and announced, and it takes effect. By the time it takes effect, suppose on its own the aggregate demand curve has come to this point. If the aggregate demand curve has on its own come to this point, then this government action will push it beyond this level. So government will push it to this position. What will happen as a result? It will end up causing inflation. So the policy action, instead of controlling for the period of recession through which the economy was to go, it had to go because it took a lot of time for the government to recognize and implement the policy action. Instead of correcting the recession, the action ends up raising inflation. Instead of solving a problem, it ends up becoming a problem. So these are practical problems. Okay, there are other problems which are discussed in the book. I will not go into details of that. Crowding out, I have already discussed. Take a minute to go through what I have done, and please let me know if there are any questions. I'll take a look at your questions in the meanwhile, and then I'll start my next topic. Take a couple of minutes. Let me start with this question on externality. Externalities I have already explained again, so I don't need to go into details of that. Incomplete information could be, there is a question regarding incomplete information and asymmetric information. Incomplete information could be at the end of either parties. Asymmetric information means that one party has more information than the other party. Okay. Externalities I have already explained. Free rider problem I have discussed. I didn't discuss it at a place where it was discussed in the book. I discussed when I was explaining non-excludability. Okay. Lemons problem is the common name for problem of asymmetric information. That what you are buying may turn out to be lemon instead of a peach. Peach is the name for a good quality product, and lemons is the name given for the bad quality product. It's standard. These are standard words in the literature on asymmetric information. Adverse selection, moral hazard. It is discussed at length in our book. The adverse selection is the problem that arises before the transaction has occurred. The people who are likely to have bad consequences are more likely to engage in a transaction. So people who are more likely to default on the loan are more likely to take loans because they know the higher interest will not affect them. Or the people who has a bad car will be more willing to sell the car even if the price is low, because you know that the quality of his car is even lower than the price for which he is being paid. There are questions regarding when emissions cannot be effectively measured. Yes, emissions cannot be effectively measured, but that doesn't mean that we don't take any action. Some action has to be taken even if it is imperfect, so that it can be controlled to some extent at least. To say that we need to wait till the time we get exactly perfect thing, I don't think that is possible. Merit goods and demerit goods. Merit goods and demerit goods are private goods, but the consumption of which has severe externalities. The goods consumption of which has huge positive externalities are called merit goods, and the consumption of which has huge negative externalities are called demerit goods. Fiscal multiplier, I think I have already explained twice yesterday. I would request you to go through the discussion yesterday. Crowding out basically means that if the government is borrowing, it is leaving fewer funds available for private borrowing. Okay, and therefore the private spending, for instance, investment will decline. Think of it: the private savings are say just worth 100 rupees in the economy. Savings are worth 100 rupees, and the government is taking 70 rupees out of that. Only 30 rupees will be left for the private sector to borrow. No, that is the idea of crowding out. If the government is running lower degree of deficit, as a result, the government deficit is only 40 units. It leaves 60 units to be borrowed by the private sector. Okay, so less crowding out. That is the idea. I think we are done with most of the questions. So now, price cap policy? Let me take this last question. What is the price cap policy of the government in the intervention to minimize market power? We have seen that the market power has two effects. A, it leads to lower output being supplied, and B, it leads to higher price. So the government can control the adverse consequence in terms of price by keeping the price at some level, by putting a ceiling, fixing the maximum possible price that the firms can charge. Sorry, I said last question, but this is a question pertaining to what I just said, and it's a very important concept, so let me discuss it. Recessionary gap is simply when there is the level of output is less than the level of output at the full employment level. So why, suppose output is this, and this is the level of output at full employment level, this gap is called the recessionary gap. The government needs to fill this gap to bring employment back to the full employment level. Okay, now let's move to the topic on money. Most of the things many things on money you would have studied already, so I do not think I should spend time on that stuff. I would rather quickly go through that and spend more time on the more rigorous stuff, which requires explanation, that is the theories of money demand and others. So, so far we have discussed the issue of fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is one policy that the government can use in order to affect the economy. The other policy is monetary policy. This monetary policy is through the use of money. But before we come to the use of monetary policy, let's first discuss the basics of money. And to give you a broad overview of what we need to do, see, the monetary policy affects the economy by changing the supply of money and through that the rate of interest, changing the rate of availability of credit. So we need to understand the process of credit creation and the process of determination of rate of interest. So for that we need to understand what money is, the theories of money demand, theories of money supply, and process of credit creation. And then we'll study the practical issues pertaining to monetary policy. First question is, what is money? Money. You must have studied about what money is. So money is basically a set of assets which can perform the functions that money is supposed to perform. When it comes to functions of money, we talk about the medium of exchange, store of value, unit of account. Okay, so money is basically something, money basically consists of a set of liquid assets. Liquid in the sense that you can easily use them for making transactions. That is the idea. The functions of money are discussed in your book at length. Basic idea is that if there is no money, then you will have to make transactions using goods. So one good will be exchanged for others, which is called the barter economy. And you can understand how problematic it would be if you were to if you were to make transactions using only commodity versus commodity. Money is also a unit of account. Today, if you want to buy any commodity, you can say, okay, this good is worth this money, this much. So you can say, okay, laptop is say worth 60,000 rupees, a desktop is worth 40,000 rupees, a pen is worth say 20 rupees, and so on. Which would not be possible if we didn't have a common thing in which we would be measuring prices. And this becomes very helpful because we can you can understand very easily the importance of having the clear-cut prices in terms of a single thing. Okay, money serves as a standard of deferred payment. You can store value. If I earn 1000 rupees today and I store it. I can hang on to this 1000 rupees even for 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and I can use those 1000 rupees later. Okay, store of value. Imagine buying grain with this 1000 rupees and trying to use this grain after 3 years. You can understand it will perish. So it will be of hardly any use after 3 years, or any other any vegetable commodity for that matter. Basically, these days we have liquid financial assets. These days for money, we have assets. So these days for money we use financial assets only, and the assets which are liquid. And also there is a third issue. Financial assets means these financial assets are issued by some financial institutions. Not these are financial assets for you, these are financial liabilities for the institution which is issuing them. Okay, and in this we talk about only certain types of financial institutions. So financial assets issued by certain financial institutions. Among financial institutions, we focus here on financial intermediaries. So there are certain financial intermediaries which we call the banks, commercial banks and cooperative banks. So basically in India and of course all over the world these days, as money we talk about liquid financial assets issued by some financial intermediaries. Okay, more on this later. For now, let me just look at the theories of money demand. Because what matters for us is the interest rate, and that is determined by demand and supply. Interest rates are determined by the interaction of demand and supply for money. Okay, theories of money demand. We study here 4 theories of money demand. One is the quantity theory of money. Then the Keynesian theory. Then the approach by Baumol. Then the portfolio approach. And then finally we approach the theory by Milton Friedman. Basically, the theory of quantity theory of money basically says that there are 2 versions of this theory given in your book. One pertains to the case where we are treating both deposits and credit and cash as money, and the first case where only it is the cash which is money. I'll just focus on the first part, money in circulation. The first part, because second can be understood as the corollary of that. The basic idea of quantity theory of money is the following. MP is equal to P. T is the number of transactions. Suppose we make 10 transactions in the economy, and P is the average price level for each of them. Suppose I make 10 transactions, and each transaction is worth say rupees 20. So PT will be equal to 200. In order to make 200 rupees worth of transactions, I'll need 200 rupees with myself. But then I don't need 200 rupees of money, because every unit of money serves multiple transactions. So each unit multiple transactions. So just think about it. I use some 100 rupee note to buy something from a person A. The person A uses the same 100 rupee note to buy something from person B. And person B uses the same 100 rupee note to buy something from person C. Suppose all these transactions take place within this week. So the same 100 rupee note has served 4 transactions. So it has served as money worth 400 rupees. Why? Because it changed hands 4 times. So the average number of transactions that a unit of money serves during a given period is called the velocity of money. So M is the stock of money available in the economy. V is the velocity of money. So this is the total supply of money, and the money service is available. This is PT, the demand for money. So according to quantity theory of money, my MV is equal to PT. It is not discussed in your book, but let me complete this here. One measure of transactions, if we keep ourselves confined to the transaction involving currently produced goods and services, that will be given by the current income. So that will be MV is equal to PY. So the proponents of quantity theory of money argued the following. Y is fixed in the short run because they were talking about the full employment level of output. This is fixed in the short run. This is fixed. This is V does not change over in the short run because it is fixed by payment habits of people. Okay. M can be changed by the central bank. So this tells you that as V is fixed and P is fixed, that means P is equal to MP by Y. This means as money supply, with V and Y being constant, as money supply doubles, P doubles. So prices rise in proportion to money. But a better, another version of this theory was the Cambridge approach. Cambridge approach basically says that suppose you have your total real income is Y, price level is P. Suppose your so nominal income is PY. Out of this total income, you will keep a fraction for in terms of money. Okay, so demand for money is equal to K times PY. PY is your nominal income, but you need to make transaction which can be made only using money. You would like to keep a fraction of your total liquid income in terms of money. That is the basic idea. Okay. A Keynesian theory of money demand. According to Keynes, there are three motives for holding money. One is the transaction demand. Other is precautionary demand. And third is speculative demand. Transaction demand, you need to make transactions. And obviously transactions will be more is your income. So this is a positive function of income. Precautionary demand, again, there are certain expenditures which you cannot foresee now. Okay, but you may need to make those transactions. Again, these transactions will be a function of your income. Why? Third is speculative demand. Speculative demand basically means the following. If you are not holding money, then according to this theory, you will be holding bonds, which is something that will give you interest. Okay, you hold money because money allows you to make transactions, number one. You also hold money because on the bonds you can suffer capital losses, okay, which you cannot hold on money. If you have 100 rupees now, it will continue to be 100 rupees even after 1 year. But what about a bond? Suppose you are buying a bond worth rupees 1000 today. After 1 year, its price declines to rupees 900. You lose rupees 100. Okay, this is what you call capital loss. Of course, you will be earning some interest on that. There are coupon payments associated, for instance. Okay, but then the yield on a bond has two components. A, the rate of interest, and B, the capital gain or capital loss. If the capital losses are so high that they even sort of swamp the interest payments, then the return on bonds can be negative, while the return on money, nominal return on money, will always be zero. That is the reason when there is an expectation of decline in bond prices, one would like to hold money. Okay, and when do bond prices decline? When they are very high. Okay, and bond prices are very high. That means, I hope you would, being a student of finance, you would understand very well that the rate of interest and bond prices are inversely associated with each other. So, bond prices are very high. That means interest rates are very low. That means when the interest rates are very low, you would like to hold on to money. Okay, and that explains you. Let me take it quick to the diagram that is given in your book. As the interest rates decline, that means the bond prices rise. At one level of interest, one price level of bond, you would realize that now the bond price will definitely decline. Okay, so as the price level of bond rises above that, that means the rate of interest falls below that rate of interest. You convert all your wealth into money. Okay? you get this diagram. So as the interest rate falls, this is called the critical rate of interest. As the interest rate falls below this, you convert entire wealth into money. But then there is a problem. There are a large number of individuals in the economy. Rate of interest, so they will shift at this rate of interest, others will shift at this rate of interest, others will shift at this rate of interest. So if you, for one individual, the money demand at given rate of interest given by this. If for the other, you will have to draw a diagram along with this. If you add the money demand of all the individuals at a given rate of interest, you will get this type of money demand. Okay. When the interest rate is very, very low, that is bond prices are very, very high, everyone thinks that yes, now bond prices will definitely decline. No one will be willing to hold money in that case. Howsoever much money there is in the economy, it will be absorbed. Okay, instead of trying to, this is called the liquidity trap region. Okay. Third theory is by Baumol and Tobel. It's called the inventory theoretic approach. Inventory theoretic approach has the basic idea. I think you in QT, all of you study the inventory theory. So for you, it should not be difficult to understand. Let me give you intuitive idea about what this is. Again, whatever, suppose you get your income in the on the first of the month, and then you can either use it for making transaction. Then you can either keep it in the bank, or you can keep it as cash. If you are keeping it in the bank, then you are earning interest. But then you cannot earn. You cannot make transactions using that. If you're keeping entire amount in the bank, you will be able to earn interest. But then whenever you need to make a transaction, you need to rush to the bank and withdraw money, which involves you will have to incur transaction cost. Running to the bank, of course, is not costless. On the other hand, if you want to avoid your trips to the bank, you will have to keep everything in terms of cash with yourself. You will forego the interest. So there is a trade-off involved. Holding money, you are able to make transactions, but you forego interest. And holding deposits, you are able to have to earn interest, but you need to make trips to the bank. So there is a trade-off involved. So you would like to optimize the number of trips to the bank. Maybe you go to the bank only once a month. In the beginning of the month, you withdraw your money, withdraw your salary, and then you don't go to the bank. Or maybe you keep 50% of your salary into the bank, so that keeps earning interest till 15th of the month, and then on 15th you withdraw the rest of it. So at least for 15 days your money, your salary is earning interest. Or maybe you make 3 trips to the bank. On the first, you withdraw 1/3, so 2/3 of your salary is earning interest for first 10 days. On the 11th, you withdraw the remaining half of the remaining, that is another 1/3. The remaining 1/3 is earning interest for 20 days, and so on. So as you are leaving more money into your banking account, that is, you are making more trips to the bank, you are able to earn higher interest. Okay, but as you are making more trips to the bank, your average money holdings decline. But then, as the interest rate rises, you would like to have more trips to the bank. As a result, your money holdings will decline. So money demand will be a negative function of rate of interest, as Keynesian theory said. Okay, so that is the gist of the Baumol-Tobin approach. That is, the number of trips that you would like to make to the bank depends on the cost of these trips and also the interest that is paid. Higher is the interest paid, you would like to keep more in the bank. And therefore, of course, Baumol talked in terms of bonds, but you can see there are two things you can think about. One thing is that you can hold it in terms of bank deposit, the bank is paying you interest. and you need to make transaction with the bank, so you have to incur a transaction cost. Other way of looking at this is that you are holding bonds. Okay, so you convert your entire 20 or 20 days or 2/3 of your salary into the bonds. Okay, and then gradually so either you can think in terms of the bank deposits and money, or you can think of it in terms of bonds. It doesn't affect. The point is whether it is bonds or deposits, both of these don't allow you to make transactions. Number one, both of these allow you to, both of these require some transaction fee for conversion into cash. Okay, and see, both of these give you interest payments. The point is, higher is the rate of interest being paid, lower is the holdings of money. That is the crucial point coming out of the inventory theoretic approach. Okay, higher is the cost of transfer from bonds or bank deposits to money. Lower is the holding of bonds or bank deposits, and higher is the money holdings. So it brings in another factor. Quantity theory of money. The theory by it is also written in the book. It is Friedman's restatement of quantity theory of money. There are 2-3 things that need to be noted. A, while according to the K is a constant, Milton Friedman says that K is a function of many variables. And in order to understand that, just think about a producer who is buying some input into the production process. The consumer, as in deciding as to how much of an input to hire, the producer looks at 2-3 things. The producer looks at the level of output that needs to be produced. Higher is the level of output, higher is the amount of factor to be hired. Accordingly, here the demand for money also depends on income level. Okay, but Milton Friedman doesn't look at the current income level. Milton Friedman looks at a longer term measure of income, that is permanent income. Okay, that is one thing. The second, just as the demand for any particular input depends on the prices of alternative assets, alternative factors of production, if the prices of alternative factors of production are lower, obviously you would like to use them more and this factor of production less. Okay, similar is the case with money also. We need to look at the alternative assets in the form of which your wealth can be held. And if the interest on these in the yield on these alternative assets is higher, you would like to economize money holdings. That means K will be lower in that case. How? And what could these be? One is the bonds we have already seen. Bonds give you rate of interest, R, and bonds also give you capital gains. So higher is the yield on these bonds, lower is the demand for money. Number one. Number two, money also, the value of value of money also depletes due to inflation. Prices are rising, the real value of money goes on declining. But look at, there are things like durable goods, consumer durables, for instance. Okay, prices of these things do not decline with the declining price level, rather the prices keep on rising at the same rate at which the general price level rises. So that becomes another substitute for holding money. And therefore, as the inflation is higher, the holdings of money would decline because the opportunity cost of holding money declines. Okay, just as we have the case of bonds, another example is that of stock returns. Okay, finally, let me look at the price level. It should be straightforward. We are looking at the real money balances. If the price level is rising, in order to make the same real transaction, we need twice as much money. So as P rises, demand for money rises in the same proportion. Finally, demand for money is behavior towards risk. We have seen the Keynesian theory of speculative demand, and that theory tells us that a consumer will, as far as the speculative demand is concerned, speculative demand will be entirely for bonds or money, depending on whether the interest rate is above or below the critical rate of interest. Now, James Tobin added another dimension to that. He said, yes, as you are holding more bonds, you are getting higher return interest rate. Okay, but then bonds always come with a risk. Okay, we have assumed that okay, people say that okay, above this price of bonds, the prices are likely to decline. So there is expectation of capital losses. But then this is just expectation. There is nothing which guarantees that okay, it will decline, certainly decline above this particular price. There is nothing like that. Prices can decline it from any price. So capital losses can occur anytime from any level. Which means if you are holding bonds, even though bonds are giving you positive nominal return, bonds always come with higher risk. Okay. So there is a particular risk return profile associated with bonds. Then people's preferences are there. People have some particular choice between risk return combination. Some particular risk return combination in the sense that with a given level of return, they would like to have some level of risk. They cannot take more risk than that. As you know, people are generally risk averse, generally. So Tobin says that people will choose their level of, even though money is giving them positive return, it is also giving them positive risk. So despite a positive expected return, people will not convert their entire holding wealth into money, into bonds, because they know it is coming with a risk. And therefore they will choose an optimal combination, optimal portfolio consisting of money and bonds. Okay, so accordingly they will decide. So they will hold both money and bonds, because even though bonds are giving them positive interest, bonds are giving them interest with some risk. Okay, of course, as the rate of interest rises, the return rises with the given rate of risk. So the risk return combination becomes more favorable to the bond holdings, and therefore as the return rises, as the rate of interest rises, people would like to hold more bonds, and therefore the money demand declines. So we get a negative relation between the rate of interest and the money demand. So basically all these theories highlight the fact that A, the rate of the money demand is a negative function of the rate of interest, and B, it depends positively on the output income level or output level. Therefore, it should be clear going forward that one thing should be clear: if we are plotting money demand against the rate of interest, it will be negative function. I think it's 10:05, so I have to stop right here. If need be, I can extend the session in the evening session to some stretch a little bit. Okay, so I think I'll have to stop here. So in the next session, we will look at the money supply, determination of rate of interest, and we'll take a quick look at monetary policy, and then we'll go to the topic on international trade. The topic on international trade is mostly descriptive. One thing which requires explanation is the theories of international trade. Okay, if you have any questions, please do post the questions. I'll try to take as many as I can in that slot. Okay, so thanks for now. See you in the evening.